Your father was also friends and colleagues with the late Carl Sagan, who I just love to bring up anytime I get a chance. And of course, it came out after Sagan passed that he was very fond of cannabis use, despite his, or actually maybe in addition to his public work, his prolific work with at Harvard and with NASA and so on. And talk about stigma busting when you think of the Carl Sagans of this world using cannabis for relaxation or creativity or what have you. And I wonder if you could, I know you grew up a little bit around Sagan, and I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on your impressions and what you remember, and especially the cannabis part.
Well, first of all, there's an awesome picture in the background of my Twitter page of me sitting on his lap and him teaching me to read. I always joke about how I was teaching him to read, teaching me to read. But he actually wrote the most powerful chapter in my dad's book, Marijuana Reconsidered. But it was under the name Mr. X because he wasn't out of the cannabis closet. And after he passed away, my dad made it public that he was Mr. X. And anybody who hasn't read that essay by Carl Sagan that was in my father's book, Marijuana Reconsidered, should read it, because if there's ever any doubt that cannabis can stimulate creativity and sort of intellectual discovery, this chapter that Carl wrote will put an end to that doubt. I mean, it's easy to find. Just Google Carl Sagan, Mr. X, scientific creativity. It pops up in a million different places. And it's just the most phenomenal chapter. It's just a short essay about how he would smoke, and then he'd have all these ideas and he'd write them down because he thought that cannabis would suppress our left brain so that our right brain, which is the creative part of our thinking, would really flourish. And then the next day he'd have to go back and edit the ideas, some of which were nonsense and some of which were very profound insights that he never would have gotten without the cannabis. So it wasn't like every single thought he had was brilliant, but some of the thoughts he never would have achieved otherwise. And it's just a really amazing book. But yeah, I remember them smoking all the time at my house when I was growing up. And, there'd just like always be a plume of marijuana smoke and the most brilliant discussions. Like I can't even convey how deep and intellectually charged the atmosphere was in my house. And, it was really interesting. There was a lot of like cognitive dissonance for me, because then I go to school and the same old tired policeman would be like, cannabis makes you amotivational and dumb. And, the policeman seems sort of amotivational and dumb. And then I go home and then there'd be like these really brilliant intellectuals in my house smoking cannabis and having these electrifying conversations and like publishing books. It wasn't just Carl Sagan, it'd be like Allen Ginsberg or like all these people publishing books on like the bestseller list. And so the message that I saw was so different from like the message that I received. And it didn't take long for me to realize what was propaganda and what was like sort of reality. I mean, kids are smart. Kids are in some ways smarter than adults. They can tell when they're being deceived. So I learned at an early age, partially thanks to Carl Sagan and a lot of the other people that were populating my living room, sort of the truth about cannabis.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that your dad told me this when I got to interview him. He didn't actually try cannabis until after he published his book, and he was at faculty parties, and there was always a circle there, a cannabis circle, and he passed on it. And eventually, Carl Sagan convinced him to give it a try, and then they became smoking buddies. And your dad actually told me a story about him and Carl, which you may have heard this, but I think it's worth sharing anyways.
Any story I've heard 1,000 times, believe me.
It's worth sharing. So the story goes, they used to meet for dinner with their wives regularly, and Dr. Lester Grinspoon would have a couple joints in his pocket, one for before the meal they would share together and one for after. him and Carl Sagan. And after dinner one night, Sagan asks him if he could take the second joint home with him because he wants to finish up the last couple chapters of his book. And I'll never forget that anecdote. Just, it brings us back around to the concept of learning how to use cannabis in a creative, productive way. And you can't ask for a better model than the Carl Sagans of this world.
Yeah, he's more intelligent than I think many of the prohibitionists put together. Added together. That's true. And I just remember them smoking, and Carl would always have a little microphone, a little recording device, and they'd be talking. Then he'd be like, "Oh, hang on a second." Then he'd be like, humans evolved out of the savannah in the 11th century. He'd have some insight that he'd record. Then he'd put his microphone away. Then he'd return to the conversation. And absolutely, I mean, I saw that in action, and it certainly was a lot more compelling than the sort of prefabricated anti-drug message, and that's sort of the tragedy of it all.